Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first of 3 Zoom author talks for Central PA Fun, Food, Understanding Nutrition. My name is Josh McConnell, and I'm a librarian at the Altoona Area Public Library. With me tonight is Katie Greenleaf Martin. She's the district library consultant for the Altoona district, and Barb Mitchell, county coordinator for the Cambria County Library System. The developed resources reported in this project are supported by the National Library of Medicine, National Institutes of Health under Cooperative Agreement number UG4LM012342 with the University of Pittsburgh Health Sciences Library System. The content is solely the responsibility of the authors and does not necessarily represent the official views of the National Institute of Health. If you have questions, please submit them in the Q&A section of your Zoom at the bottom of your screen, and I will be reading your questions to the author at the end of the presentation. Okay, so tonight we have Nick Sharma. Nick Sharma is a molecular biologist turned cookbook author and photographer. Nick is currently a columnist for Series Eats, Food 52, and The Guardian Feast. He is also a contributor to the New York Times cooking section. His first cookbook season, Big Flavors, Beautiful Food, was a James Beard and IACP award finalist. His latest book, The Flavor Equation, was recently named Book of the Year by Delicious UK. Prior to this, Nick was the featured food columnist at the San Francisco Chronicle. Nick resides in Los Angeles, California with his husband and 2 mischievous cats and a puppy. This is his latest book, The Flavor Equation, now named a Best Cookbook of 2020 by the Washington Post, the LA Times, JP Morgan, Barron's, Amazon, the Smithsonian, Martha Stewart, Forbes, CNN, The Observer Food Monthly UK, the Times UK, the Irish Times, Delicious Australia, and many more. Without any further ado, here is Nick Sharma, everybody. Welcome.
Hi, Josh. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me here today. It's a great pleasure and honor to talk about the book, but also about cooking, which is one of the reasons why I've been invited today, is to talk about how to make cooking fun at home for you, with your friends and families, and also for those of you who are cooking just for yourselves. So I'll start off by talking a little bit about the book, because I feel a lot of the content of this book, there are a lot of ideas here that I think you can pull into your own everyday cooking at home. And we'll go through this book in stages and briefly touch upon the fun parts of cooking and the not so fun parts too. And we'll try and build from there. And then, yeah, so let's do this. And like Josh said at the end, if you have any questions, feel free to ask and I'll do my best to answer them. All right, so I'm going to share my screen and I hope this works properly. The first question before we even get into this discussion is, why do we cook at the end of the day? What drives us to cook? And when you think about it, there are basically 2 reasons. The first one being nutrition. We need food to provide us energy for all our daily activities, because that's what makes us get through the day. And even through the night when you're sleeping, you still need to burn calories. There are certain processes taking place in the body. And so fuel provides that fuel in the form of carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. And these break down and provide us with that energy. Another reason why we cook in terms of nutrition is to increase nutrient availability. A lot of times foods have to be unlocked. And what I mean by that is often foods are not that easy to digest or to metabolize. And in order to do that, cooking food by different methods, be it heat, and heat is the most common form of cooking. There are other methods like, people use acids when they're making ceviche and stuff like that, that changes texture and makes it safe to eat. But one of the reasons why we like to cook is because it increases nutrient availability. It unlocks a lot of these nutrients, a lot of vitamins, and besides the elements I mentioned before, carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, it helps unlock these things, and then our biochemical processes can take place, and that's how metabolism can perform. So you can burn stuff and you can also build stuff. And that is one of the very important reasons why cooking, at the end of the day, why we cook. it's for nutrition. The second reason why we cook, and you can see a lot of these things will cross over with each other, nutrition and survival are kind of codependent. Another reason why we cook is for survival. Without food, we can't survive. We need to eat in order to survive. And a reason why we cook, some of these are also historical, and also why humans evolved in a certain way and also became a successful dominant species on this planet, was because of the discovery of heat, how to produce heat for our own needs. One of these was to make food safe for consumption. Cooking food, boiling water, for example, sterilizing food, milk, you know, um, milk when it's pasteurized, for example, it becomes safe for us to eat. So a lot of harmful bacteria and pathogens are destroyed by heating, and cooking helps us survive because we're eating food that's safe. Another thing that cooking has provided us with, and again, this is in terms of survival, is food preservation. Think about all the times we've had meat, fish, dairy products, fruits, vegetables, all of these ingredients that we initially were only able to get based on our geography and based on the weather, what was available. These techniques helped us preserve a lot of these ingredients for a very long period of time. Of course, technology has changed so much now that you can do this whenever you want at your convenience. A lot of these ingredients are now available year round, but the two primary reasons why we cook at the end of the day are for nutrition and survival. And those are some of the themes that we're going to explore throughout this talk today. So when I was writing this book, or rather when I decided to write this cookbook, it's a science-based cookbook. And one of the things I wanted to do was talk about flavor. One of the things that I had been trained to do as a food writer when I moved from science into food media was to think of flavor as a two-dimensional component, aroma and taste. And I thought that was kind of fascinating and also quite contradictory, because as a food writer, you're also taught to always write a story or a personal narrative behind a recipe, so you can share that emotional connection that you have with food, and that also entices people to come and try out your recipes and cook them. And you're developing a bond. You're developing a bond with food, but also getting a chance to share and talk about it with people. And I thought that was really fascinating, because here I'm being encouraged to do these two things, but quite separately. And when writing the flavor equation and researching it, I realized that flavor is just so much more than just these two things. There are emotions, we've got our memories that come into play, and then we have the sights, like how food looks, the shapes, the colors, the sound, the textures or the mouthfeel. And I'll be referring to the texture of food as mouthfeel throughout this discussion today. There's just so many different components to what flavor really is. And I felt that it was extremely important to describe it as such. So flavor, I've defined flavor in this book as a combination of emotions, sights, sound, mouthfeel, aroma, and taste. The last two, like I said earlier, the two that we're most familiar with, and those are the things I've been taught to pay attention to quite a bit in cooking and in food writing. So we'll kick off the discussion with the fun one, which is emotion. Not that they all aren't fun, but emotion is probably the one that's, I think, the most special to most of us. It brings us into the kitchen, and it can also drive us away from cooking. So our emotions are quite interesting. They have the ability to influence how we perceive flavor, and how flavor also interacts with our emotions. And if you think about it, you could probably recollect some kind of emotional experience that you've had. For example, in my case, a couple of years ago, I lost my dog to cancer. And when that happened, I lost my appetite for a couple of days. I think it was actually 2 weeks, where I really wasn't interested in eating. When I'm taking a test, I lose my appetite. I'm so stressed out, I don't want to eat at all. And when I'm happy, I go for ice cream. I love cake and ice cream. So those are the two things I run towards. So emotions, as you can expect, does influence how we eat. And that's something very important to consider, because right now with the pandemic, a lot of you, and including me, are going through these different ups and downs with the news cycles and what's happening. and just being at home. And so emotions do play a really important part in how we cook and eat and experience flavor. And the figure that I'm sharing with you right now, it's from my book. And what's happening here, it's based on a study. And what these scientists did in this study was quite interesting. They looked at responses and how people approached flavor or taste, and in response to different emotional changes that had occurred in their life. In the first case, that this is of a sports team. So when they lost, when the fans were asked how they tasted food after their favorite sports team lost the game, it was really interesting and not surprising that they felt sad, dejected, disappointed. What was really interesting was that they started to observe the food samples that they were given as tasting sour and unpleasant. On the other hand, we have when on the right side, if you look where everything's in green, when their sports team won a game, people were happy, they were jubilant, they were excited, and their food tasted sweeter. Now, this has so many dramatic implications, as we'll talk about a little more. Now, if you look to the second half of the figure at the bottom, people were then given food samples that tasted a certain way. Food that tasted bitter, as you see on the left, caused feelings of aversion and disgust, and food that tasted sweet caused it reward, that people felt like they were being rewarded, and there was this feeling of exuberance and joy and being happy. So now if you think about this, this is quite fascinating because we go through a range of emotions every day, and that's affecting how we experience flavor, that affects our appetite. And think about, you're watching a TV show, your favorite TV show, and during that TV show, you could be enticed to eat a bunch of different things, or you might not. And so this is where I think it's really important. And I always tell people this is something like an old adage where people say we cook with love, cook with pause. So I always tell people when you're cooking, cook with positive emotions, because if you don't cook with positive emotions, it shows. When I cook recipes and I'm testing them from work, and if I'm upset, angry, or stressed out, it never works. I've had recipes fail, and then I say, let's just take a break today and come back to it when I'm ready. So, pay attention to your emotions, what's happening around you. Is that affecting how you feel when you're cooking? These are some things I think we all take for granted. We just need to pay attention to them. We all know what they mean, but we just need to pay attention to them. So emotions have the ability to influence our perception of flavor, and consequently, and not surprisingly, our ability to eat and drink food. Another example of this that I'm going to give you, which is also quite fascinating, was an experiment that was done on a jury. And the members of the jury were given a drink that was sweet and a drink that was sour. People who had the sweet drink voted much more favorably towards the decision in a positive way, and people who had the sour drink voted the other way in a much more negative fashion, unfavorably. So it's so fascinating that the impact of our emotions and the impact that taste can have on our emotions can unfold quite dramatically on a day-to-day basis. And it's such an important thing that, again, like I said, we take for granted. But I think, if we pay attention to it, it can really influence our cooking, how we present food, how we eat food, how we interact with our family, friends, and relatives when we're out eating with them or at home. It's just such an important component of experiencing flavor and just enjoying that experience, and also cooking. The second part of this equation that we're going to get into is a little bit related to memory here. And it's also a part of emotion. And one of the things, while I'm talking about this right now, is I want you to think about the last time you were happy or sad. What were you craving? Or did you actually even crave anything? Were you hungry? And also think about the joyous and sad occasions, celebrations and then funerals. These are two important things. And depending on the culture that you grew up in, funerals are also something that's experienced quite differently. In some cultures, you'll have food isn't really a big part of the thing of the funeral. And in some cultures, you'll have foods that are prepared to celebrate the life of the person that has passed in remembrance. And I think just also kind of analyzing emotion also from a cultural perspective can also open new doors in the way we approach our relationship with cooking and flavor. The second component of the flavor equation is sight. Now, I think today we can all kind of agree on the fact that sight is such an important tool for most of us. You know, food comes in a variety of shapes, sizes, and colors. If you go to the markets, at least when you could go to them, and a lot of us, like even me, I'm doing a lot of online grocery shopping right now. I'm trying to, which is a terrible way to judge the quality of food. I'm actually trying to judge the ripeness of food by photos, which is actually not helpful. I've often received ingredients that are either wrong or they're not ripe enough for me to use them at that point. So, you know, how food looks, the shapes, the size, and the colors are just so important. Travel and food television shows. Now, those have risen quite exponentially over the past couple of years. So it's really interesting to see how food has become such an important cool factor in food media, where everyone's focused on how food looks, and you have these beautiful you know, videos of food being prepared and shown on all these different TV shows and even movies. There are so many chef-based or, you know, movies that are coming out now. I think there's actually one called The Chef. Then food magazines. Now, I've worked in worked for food magazines. I've photographed and written recipes for them and even styled. And that has been a very interesting experience because in food media, because no one's actually eating recipes, you're not cooking for them directly, you're trying to entice them to cook, your food needs to look good, it needs to be presented well. So magazines and a lot of food media have that one factor. And I originally started out as a food blogger. So for me, a large part of connecting with my audience was cooking recipes at home, testing the recipes, writing them, but also then learning how to style and photograph the recipes so people would eat with their eyes first and then cook. Another thing that's happened over the past couple of years and quite quickly is the rise of social media platforms. And all of them are so highly visual. I spend a lot of time scrolling through, you know, platforms like Instagram or Pinterest, looking at food photos all day long to get inspiration, also to get excited about cooking something new. It's just crazy how this has blown up over the past couple of years. Another important tool in the kitchen is sight. And if you think about it, a lot of us have been taught to use our intuition when we cook rather than follow recipes. I grew up in India originally, and a lot of the recipes that were handed down to me were based on understanding the endpoints during cooking, based on sight or sounds. And I'll get to sounds in a little bit, but in sight, you can tell when a cake is done just by how golden brown the top is. You know, I was making chocolate chip cookies last weekend, and I was looking at the different colors that the chocolate chip to cookie takes on as it bakes at different time points. Obviously, as you can guess, when you bake it longer at the same temperature, it starts to get dark brown and toasty. So even the sight, the color, tells you the end point of cooking. Sight can also be a symbol for ripeness. You know, when you're looking for fresh fruits and vegetables, you can tell if it's bright green, then your lettuce is fresh. You know, if it's turning dark brown or it gets those purplish pink spots, you know, it's been sitting there for a while, so it's aging and it won't taste as nice as it would if it was just taken out the day off. Now, sight is quite interesting because it also, like emotion, can influence our perception of flavor, and it also works both ways, vice versa. And while writing and doing some research, I decided to run a very informal experiment on people. I put a questionnaire out there, send it out over the internet, and ask people to participate in a questionnaire where I asked them two questions. The first question was about color, and the second was about the shape. It probably sounds very bizarre, and a lot of them were quite confused when I asked them this question, but I asked them to us, what taste did you associate a certain color with, or most commonly associated with? And the same question was asked of the different shapes. The results were quite surprising and also not surprising. So if you look at the first part of this figure and ignore the fact that I've mentioned fatty and hot for now in the taste section, those aren't actually tastes. I've left them in here, and I'll get to that at the towards the end of this talk. Um, if you look at the figure, you'll see hot, most people associated it with red color, sweet with a light brown, sour with the yellow, savory and salty, people associated that mostly with this brown color, and bitter with green, and then fatty was colorless or white. What I followed back with some of the people who responded to this question, and I asked them, so why did you guys go with these? Why did you guys go with one color over the other? In the case of hot, it's not surprising. Everyone came up with red peppers, red chilies, and that was a highly significant correlation over there. In the case of sweet, I had two responses. The second one was red color, which isn't shown here because it was slightly less than the percentage, or rather the number of responses received for brown. And when I asked them about why they picked brown color, a lot of them said molasses, brown sugar, maple syrup, honey. I actually thought everyone would go with the regular white sugar that we all have at home, but that's the color that they picked. And then the second response, like I mentioned, was red. And when I asked that group of people why they said red, which isn't shown here in the graph, they said it was because of fruit. So red apples, strawberries, raspberries. Now, sour. In the case of sour, most of them thought of lemons and limes. In savory, a lot of people said meat. That was the first thing that came to their mind. And a lot of the vegetarians in the question, who were part of this discussion, said miso, which is also comes in various shades of brown. Bitter was bitter greens. Salty was the one where I didn't get a clear answer from people. Some people said smoked salts, which I was kind of surprised by because that's not a common ingredient with cooking. And actually, that's an ingredient I very rarely even use in my own recipes because I'm not sure if a lot of people actually find it easily available. And so a larger response, a better explanation for this was some of the people said that a lot of salt is mined, so they were thinking of rocks. And so that's where the brown color came from. And in the case of fats, which is fatty, a lot of people thought of oils or butter, which is usually yellowish white in color. And so white was the predominant answer. Now, coming to the second part of this question that I asked people, and this was about shapes and tastes. And in this, if you look at the different shapes that people predominantly chose with which tastes, you'll see that salty was a triangle, and sweet and sour were circular. And this was because salty people thought of salt crystals. I thought people would actually have the same response with sweet because of sugar crystals, but that wasn't the case. A lot of them thought of the liquid sweeteners when I asked them about this. And also some of them said that a lot of fruits are circular in shape. And so that's why they were thinking of this. With the chilies, a lot of them felt that the symbol for heat is hot, for heat, temperature-wise, is a triangle. A lot of them gave that as a response. And another reason was the pointy edges of the chili because it tapers at the bottom. So some of these responses are so fascinating because if you think about it, we spend a lot of time looking at media. We look at ads constantly, a lot of advertisements in TV, in books, in magazines and newspapers, and on social media, the internet platforms. We're constantly being primed with this kind of data, which pushes us often in a certain direction. So not only is nature doing it, but also man-made platforms. And I thought that was really interesting how we have started to, most of us associate these colors and these shapes with different tastes. And that is something that I think kids would love at home. Imagine if you've got a kid that's bored and you're trying to encourage them into cooking. One of the things that I loved personally growing up as a kid was being asked to, interact with my vegetables and fruits and talk about the colors with my parents, and even at school with my teachers. And I think kind of bringing that back in is the fun element often, especially for a child where colors can just feel so vibrant, alive, and fresh. It's such a beautiful way to get people involved in cooking as well as even kids, and play around with this when you're when you're presenting your food. We do that as food stylists and food photographers. We try to put contrasting colors next to each other to make things pop or don't pop. Like if food is brown, a lot of delicious food is actually brown in color. And to make things pop, we add, like a sprinkling of red chilies or green herbs, green chilies. That just creates this visual pop. And I think understanding color and learning how to play with it along with shapes and textures can be quite useful in the kitchen. The next element in the flavor equation is sound. If any of you have watched the Great British Bake Off, that's one of my favorite cooking shows to watch on TV, especially right now. I've been actually going through the previous seasons again and again because they're just so much fun. And if you paid attention to the episodes, often the judges will test the quality of a pastry or bread by the sound that it makes. They'll go and tap sourdough bread to see how hollow it sounds as an index of how good it is. We're also doing that all the time at grocery stores. When you buy a watermelon, you tap a watermelon to see how ripe it is. Even I've heard like with squash, people will sometimes tap it and they can sense whether it's ready or not. So sound is a very important cooking tool, not only from this method to judge the quality of ingredients and also the quality of the dish at the end, like in the case of bread or pastries. It's a very important cooking tool because you can use sound to know when to add things, when to remove them. I spoke to a lot of people that had lost their sense of sight and even sound to try and understand how they cooked at home. And I remember speaking, and this always stays in my mind, I spoke to someone who had lost their sense of sight, and he told me how at home, when he's cooking, he listens to the sound that the water makes from his faucet in the kitchen when it drips. He is able to tell how hot the water is based on the sound. And I thought that was something so fascinating because if you think about the science of it, it's absolutely true. We all know that the density of water and even air actually changes with a change in temperature. And the fact that he was so attuned to knowing whether it was cold or hot, depending on that drop, the sound made when it dropped, I thought that was mind blowing because I take all my senses for granted because I'm in control of them. But here's someone who is now relying on his sense of sound to cook in the kitchen. Another way that sound also affects our perception of flavor and specifically taste is if you've been on an airplane. One of the things I've noticed when I've been on airplanes, I always get a glass of cold tomato juice. I never drink it otherwise when I'm on land or at home. I'll never go out of my way to, oh, I want a glass of tomato juice today. That actually never happened. But when I'm on a plane, almost inevitably, I've always asked for a glass of tomato juice. And there's some science to this. It turns out that several years ago, the Lufthansa Airlines, which all of you are familiar with, Lufthansa spent some money to understand why they were buying and selling so much tomato juice during their flights. It turns out because of the dry conditions in the cabin, along with the intense loud sound waves, they're at really high decibels inside a plane, that actually stimulates our taste receptors for savoriness and saltiness much more than the other taste receptors. And so there is an inclination, or we're rather pushed towards drinking saltier drinks with a lot more savoriness. And in this case, tomato juice, which contains both savory and salty elements, provides that. Now, like I mentioned earlier about the person that I spoke to had lost their sense of sight, who was using sound as a tool in the kitchen. A lot of us are always using sound in the kitchen at home. Think about the convenience tools. You've got digital timers, you've got, Alexa and Siri and all these devices, which now are an integral part of many people's lives. And they're quite useful because not only can you often use them to help you guide you during cooking, they talk to you, but they can also, like time points. You can set an alarm and say, hey, Alexa, tell me when I need to stop cooking or when I need to take this, steak out of the oven if I've been, after it's cooked and it's been left too warm in there. So sound has become really important. And then if you think about some of the day-to-day things that you're cooking with in the kitchen, one of the things I do, and this is a common Indian technique, is to fry spices in hot oil by a technique called tadka. And based on the crackling, or rather the sizzling sound that the oil makes when the spices are added, I can tell when it's time to take them off. When it stops sizzling, I take them off because I know they're cooked. And it happens in a matter of a few seconds, but that is actually my endpoint that I pay attention to versus time. I find that much more reliable. If you think about sound can also be quite exciting. A lot of chefs will play with this, and this is something I always encourage people to do at home. If you're making a dish and you have to finish the dish off, when you're garnishing it with your family or with your friends or with the people that you're with. That creates a lot of excitement at the dinner table. Um, going back to the example of the Indian dish show, we often garnish, food with flavorful hot oils that are infused with with spices. And so what I do is I bring the dish out to the table and then I pour that sizzling hot oil with the spices in front of everyone. So it creates a conversational piece. Everyone's really excited and then they're enthusiastic to eat. Another thing that you can do, this might be a bit of one of those fancy chef gastronomy things. And I actually, there are different ways to play around with this, but temperature. Sometimes frozen foods make really interesting noises when they drop. And if you have a dish that's frozen, like ice cream or like a cold soup, just tossing, say, frozen pearls of something, like frozen pearls of chocolate on a plate while you're serving the ice cream to bring it out to your guests. Again, that sound also creates, kind of entices you into what's happening. It makes the experience much more interesting. And of course, there's always music. Music is such an important part of my daily ritual when cooking. When I cook, I always have a music station on. When I write, I need music to focus. So I actually leave my Spotify station on and the music's playing continuously so I can concentrate. I need music and sound to concentrate. I actually can't concentrate in a quiet environment. I struggle quite a bit. So the gist of all this is to say that focus on sound too when you're cooking. We focus like on sight quite a bit, the colors, the shapes, and the sizes when plating food. But sound is such a fun way just to make that experience much more, fill it with enthusiasm and excitement for everyone. The next component that I'm going to talk about right now is the mouthfeel. And mouthfeel is the sciencey word for the food textures. It's a very important characteristic of food. Think about the time you've had French fries that were soggy. When they're cold, they become soggy. And that probably does not taste good. There are so many times I've tried to reheat them and it doesn't really work as well. But when you have fresh fries, they taste so good. That experience of that crunchiness is what makes it worthwhile. If you have an apple that's ripe and crisp, that again tastes so delicious. If you have an apple that's mealy, the experience is it tastes good, but it just isn't as good as if it were, crisp. And then if you think about textures, a lot of the comforting textures for me in dishes like soups are the creaminess, the smoothness. It feels velvety, very luscious. And I think that makes for a very interesting experience for me when I eat. It provides me comfort. I came across this table, which is based on a research paper that I came across where the scientists, Ultima et al., had looked into understanding how people have a preference, whether or not they have a preference for different types of food textures. And based on the responses they got, they divided people into 4 groups. The first one was chewers, and these are people that like to chew food for a really long time. So think about gummy bears and jelly beans, string cheese like the long mozzarella. I like the mozzarella cheese, which when it's stringy. Apples that are crisp, you can chew them for a while. And that again, you're releasing those sweet and sour tastes in your mouth. It feels fun. It's delicious. Brownies, oatmeals. The second group that they looked into was crunchers. And these are the people that really enjoyed food that was crunchy. I think I actually fall into this group. If you think about crisp apples and pears, like I mentioned earlier, potato chips, chocolates, celery sticks. Potato chips are quite an interesting example because, potato chips, there's just so much science gone into how potato chips are marketed. The entire experience, it's mind blowing. Not only the taste and the textures you can imagine. So think about the time you break a potato chip or you bite it, the sound that it makes when it fractures. Scientists have actually studied that to try and make a potato chip that gets you excited to eat them. Even when you open a bag of potato chips, the sound that you make, all of that is designed to increase the customer experience and make it much more favorable. Um, chocolates. Chocolates are really an interesting case study because people, depending on the chocolate brand that they're really used to eating, really play with the shape in their mouth. So there was an interesting study done by on Cadbury chocolates, which is a British brand of chocolate, which is available here now through Hershey's or I think Mars. And their chocolates, they changed the shape of the little bits on the bar. And when they changed the shape, people complained that it wasn't tasting as good and as sweet as before. The company claimed that they never changed the recipe. All they did was change the shape. And I think they eventually went back and switched back to the original shape or made a compromise. But it was really fascinating that even a change in shape based on the way people were playing with chocolate in their mouth when they tasted it on their tongue, it was influencing their perception of taste and flavor. The third category in this is suckers. And suckers are people that tend to deviate, tend to move towards food that dissolves very slowly in their mouth. So lozenges are an example. A lot of sweets like lollipops, peppermints, hard candies, the ones that we suck on for a really long time to get that flavor out. And then the final group that they categorize people into were smooshers, people that love food that's creamy. So think about the luscious, velvety textures of Greek yogurt, uh, you know, um, like a puree cauliflower soup. That would be a savory example here. And then smooth custards and puddings, bananas, ripe bananas are quite smooth and mushy. And then ice cream, which is one of my favorite foods. The next component of this discussion is aroma. And aroma is one of the things, like I mentioned earlier, is one of the things that I've been taught to as a recipe writer, and something that even I personally tend to deviate to is I run to smell a dish. I'm done after I'm done looking at it, I run to smell the dish. Or if I'm in another room and I can smell something that smells delicious, I'll come out running to smell it. Like when we barbecue at home, outside the house, when I get the smell, I run outside, and aroma or the fragrance of food is one of the most amazing qualities. It's actually the one thing that we memorize. We do not memorize taste, but we can memorize aromas of food. And think about it, whenever you're recollecting a favorite dish or even a dish that you hate, for example, what you recollect is the aroma and not the taste. Aroma is also, like sight, sound, and texture, is something that we use to get a sense of quality of the food. So, one of the things that people do in grocery stores is you go to smell bread. I've seen a lot of people do that. At farmers markets, people will often stop to smell fresh fruit like strawberries. Strawberries in spring, they smell so, I'm going to say sweet. I'm associating it with the taste here. So, I think that's just so important because understanding how food smells, that fragrance that it gives off, can tell us whether food is good. It can also tell us when food is bad. Think about spoiled milk. Spoiled milk will, if you smell it, it will almost push you to throw up. And it's a safety mechanism. So we've evolved, it's a safety mechanism. And so you don't drink the milk so you don't get sick. But on the other hand, if you smell milk that's been fermented, like yogurt or buttermilk or kefir, which is the Bulgarian fermented drink, that it's called the champagne of dairy. all of those smell so nice. They almost have this buttery, pleasantly acidic aroma, but that's never the way any of us would describe spoiled milk. Um, actually, 2 weeks ago, I should give you this example. So 2 weeks ago, I was sitting in my living room and suddenly I heard a loud boom. And I thought, you know what, it's raining in California. Maybe the ceiling fell down. Maybe, we're in a new house. Maybe the roofs weren't done properly. It turned out we had a watermelon that was sitting on the dining table and it was overripe and it blew by itself. And it smelled disgusting. It smelled acidic. And so, I mean, it was so bad, it almost made me wanted to throw up. So aromas are such an important tool when it comes to food, just understanding the quality of food, whether it's good or bad. Another thing that aroma is like sight, sound, and texture, it's also a really useful tool when it comes to cooking. I actually don't like to rely on time when I cook. I try to rely on these other senses because there's just so many interesting nuances to cooking. And one of the ways you can tell whether a dish is done is by the smell that's coming off. With cakes and cookies, you can tell when that toasty, sweet aroma is coming out of the oven. You can also tell when chocolate's burning in a chocolate chip cookie. If it's cooking for too long, you can smell that burning aroma of chocolate. If you're roasting vegetables, that's another place you can tell when to, besides looking at the visuals, when it develops those nice brown char marks on the grill pan or on the barbecue, you can tell when to flip them. Also, just by the aroma that's coming, it begins to change or it becomes much more pronounced than it was before. For example, green bell peppers. Green bell peppers, you can tell when they're done based on that. It moves from, I would say, like a green, grassy aroma to a much more softer, sweeter, almost like a barbecue smell. And that's when I know to flip green bell peppers on the stove. So aromas are such an important tool when we're cooking. Another fun thing to do at home with aromas, and I do this with people, is to do blind tests. At least when I could have people or my friends over, I would have them not taste a dish, and this also helped me with recipe testing, is cover the dish and have them smell it blindfolded. And so they haven't seen what it is, they're not biased, and then I'd ask them to tell me whether it was sweet or was it savory. And often the results can be quite surprising because if you do like a barbecue meat that has like a sweet sauce, for example, like a barbecue peach sauce, I had a lot of people think that I grilled stone fruit for them as a dessert. So it's quite funny when you play around with food and you start playing with how people respond to these things. These are just so many fun ways that you can bring that into the kitchen and also when you're serving food. Now, taste is one of the final components of the flavor equation. And taste is very important because that's the one thing that we're looking for in a dish. We always talk about a balance of flavor. When we say balance of flavor, we're actually talking about a balance of taste. We're talking about, is sweet and sour and bitter, is it all, at a level that's palatable for us, that we'll enjoy it at. Taste is quite an interesting thing because all our types of taste buds that sense the different types of taste don't develop at the same time. Babies, when they're born, the fetus gets its first taste of food when they're in their mother's womb. And at this stage, our taste for salt hasn't developed yet. In fact, our salt taste receptors develop after we're born, a couple of days after. And so if you think about it, a child that's in the mother's womb, this is where they're getting their first taste of food. And one of the first tastes that they experience is savoriness, and that's glutamate. In fact, mother's milk is quite rich in glutamate, we'll get to it, which is one of the substances, or rather the molecules, that is responsible for the savory taste in food. Taste is something highly personal, and this is something that I've learned to accept and grow as a food writer, is that not everyone is going to like the food that I cook because of the taste combinations. I deviate towards certain tastes and some people don't. I grew up in India. A lot of my flavors are strongly acidic. Um, I like a combination of sweet and sour often in my food because those are the kind of flavors, the combinations that I was raised on. And people who weren't really raised with those flavors are new to them. So it might take them a little more time to learn how to understand them. Um, Taste is also highly personal, besides where you grew up and culture, also genetics. And we'll get into that a little bit because understanding taste is quite important. It helps us keep an open mind to food. And I've had guests that come over and sometimes they don't, they might roll an eye if I give them something that they're unfamiliar with, and they want me to add something. And that is often I kind of put it down to that taste is such a personal experience that not everyone is going to enjoy things the same way as we are. So like I said, there is a genetic component to taste. And this has been extensively studied for bitter taste. I wrote about an article um, last year about bitterness and the genetics of this. And it's really fascinating because not only do certain people have a mutation in their genome for this taste receptor that recognizes bitterness, it makes them extremely sensitive to it. And because they're so sensitive to it, they'll avoid bitter foods whenever possible. And I'm actually one of them. I got tested for this. And I do not drink beer because I find it extremely bitter. I struggle drinking coffee, just plain black coffee and black tea. I need to have milk in it, sometimes a sweetener, just to mask that bitter taste. Um, and bitter vegetables, I struggle with. In India, there's a vegetable called karela, which is bitter melon, which is also used in Chinese cooking. And bitter melon is one of those dishes that my parents tried to get me into, but I've still never loved. I still avoid it like the plague because it is just so repulsively bitter to me that I can't do it. And so there is this genetic component to bitterness that affects our, how intense or how intense we perceive a lot of bitter foods. And you can overcome that a little bit by eating more of these foods, in small doses, then increasing your dosage over time. Another place where this comes into for me and a lot of other people is with olive oil. Olive oil by itself doesn't taste bitter to most people. There are some people that can actually sense bitterness in olive oil, but if you've ever made an olive oil emulsion like mayonnaise or aioli, you'll notice how intensely bitter it becomes. And that's because olive oil does contain some bitter substances, and those bitter substances can dissolve in water. And so when you're making an emulsion, you have these bitter substances coming out into the water phase, and it starts to taste bitter. And that's why in a lot of restaurants, they don't make mayonnaise usually with olive oil, just because it's so intensely bitter. And a lot of olive companies have looked into, olive oil companies and farms that breed olive plants have been looking at ways to reduce this bitterness through, plant propagation and breeding programs, but also in the methods that they use. So a lot of times when olives are brined, you'll see a lot of salt being used to mask the bitterness. And you wash it with a lot of hot boiling water, which takes away a lot of the bitterness. The second component to taste is the environment. And in the environment, like I've mentioned this throughout this talk, is the relationship between family, friends, and culture. And what's happening with family, friends, and culture is that you're getting all these responses from people all the time. So that's influencing you to make decisions. And then culture provides this background of tradition, certain dishes we love. One of the things I always tell people is mac and cheese is such a personal dish to so many people. At Thanksgiving, it's a tradition, essentially, for many folk. And the way they make it, that's the way they've loved growing up. So it's one of those dishes also like meatloaf where, coming in with a new game plan to try and change it is really not worth it because most of us love it a certain way. And that's what culture and our traditions have kind of taught us. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just something that becomes a part of our system. And then, of course, there are the non-familial influences. Like, again, I've mentioned these before, advertising, TV shows, media in general, it tends to prime us a certain way. So, right now, in food media, if you've noticed over the past couple of years, there's been a shift from a lot of Italian and European French and Italian cooking, a lot of the European cooking cuisines towards more Asian and Middle Eastern food and Africa. These are the continents where the food is now coming into a more prominent role in media. And you'll see a lot of recipes now drawing inspiration and flavors that are used in these cultures. And so there is a shift, and this will happen over time again and again. So one of the ways that I wanted to describe taste, there are 5 basic tastes. And you'll see at the end, there are these 2 things for richness and fieriness. I'll get to that in a little bit. But brightness is what gives us sourness or the acidic taste in food. And we have special taste receptors for these. Bitterness is like it is for bitter foods. So like bitter green foods, cabbages can taste bitter as well as hot to some, depending on how fresh it is. And like the example of the olive oil that I mentioned earlier. Saltiness, we're all familiar with salt. We use salt to varying degrees in our cooking for not only for taste, but also to make vegetables and meats much more tender. So it does quite a bit in our cooking. And so that we have taste receptors for salt. And one of the things I mentioned was the taste receptors for salt are one of the last receptors to actually develop in humans. Sweetness. People who are bitter averse will generally eat a lot of sweet dishes. And I actually love sweets. It's my downfall. I love sweets. I generally tend to deviate towards fruits and, like I said, ice creams earlier, and flans. Flans are one of my favorite desserts. So people who usually avoid bitter foods will tend to, make up for that through sweets. And then there's savoriness, which is the newest taste that was officially introduced into the taste groups. In order for a food to be, or rather, in order for a taste to be officially a taste, scientists have set up a couple of rules. One of them is that it has to have a specific taste receptor, and it needs to also behave independently of other taste molecules in order to produce a taste. And so umami was the most recent one that was let in, and glutamates, which are present in vegetables and in meats, like tomatoes, onions. Onions are a rich source of glutamates, garlic. That's why we add them to stocks, because they build on those flavors. And then there are a couple of other substances which are derived through the breakdown of nucleic acids, and those also provide savoriness in food. For example, shiitake mushrooms. You take fresh shiitake mushrooms and dried shiitake mushrooms, and you soak both of them in hot water, or you make a stock. The stock that's made with the dried shiitake mushrooms will have a much more intense savory profile than the fresh shiitake mushrooms. And that's because dead shiitake, or rather but dried shiitake mushrooms, because they're dried up, the nucleic acids in them have been degraded, and they have a higher concentration of these new savory substances that the fresh mushrooms won't have. So you're better off actually making your vegetable stocks, even meat stocks, by adding a handful of dried shiitake mushrooms to the hot water. Now, the last 2, richness and fieriness. I decided to include richness in this because there is a growing body of evidence by scientists to suggest that there is a special taste receptor in humans and also other animals for appreciating a taste of fat. And we always, as cooks, I'm always telling people, use flavorful fats in your food. Don't be scared of using fats when you cook. Always make a judicious use of salt and fats. But fats provide energy and also satiety. And they're a high calorie food. But look at fats. If you use a little bit of a good quality fat, you can have a delicious meal. And there are so many delicious oils and fats, from olive oil. There's mustard oil, which has a spicy flavor. Of those of you that love the taste of mustard, I highly encourage you to try mustard oil, because it provides that pop of wasabi to so many dishes that's so delicious. And then, of course, there's brown butter. People use brown butter in cooking. There are the animal fats that are rendered, like bacon, bacon fat, and also schmaltz, which comes from chicken fat. All of these add a certain degree of extra flavor to cooking. So if you're cooking a chicken, collect the drippings and put your vegetables underneath, like potatoes or whatever you're roasting, put them underneath. I put a rack on top and then put the chicken and then roast them together. So the fat drips and flavors the potatoes. And then any excess fat, actually just drain that away. The final component here is fieriness, which is not a taste. Fieriness is what I'm talking about is heat. So in terms of heat, like the response that we get when we eat chilies or black pepper, or even the burning from a cabbage, fresh cabbage can be quite pungent. And even olive oil has a pungency factor to it. So that's what I'm referring to here. It's actually an irritation to our nerves that over time our bodies have evolved to love because it's a safe, risky thing to do. And that's why we've learned to love them, because we're in a safe environment where we can take this high risk thing where, your ears are burning after you eat a hot chili, and like in those contests that people do, and that's what's happening here. And so we've learned to love them over time, and our bodies have evolved. Now,
Nick, I just wanted to interrupt you really quick. We just have a few more minutes before we do the question and answer. Okay. Okay. Thank you.
So some of this is repetitive of what we've talked, so it's easy for me to just run through this now. The role of society, family, and culture. We get cues constantly from our environment, and so society, family, and our cultural traditions play a role. Some of the examples and that you can also do at home, but also what we've been doing as people, as a society for so long, is learning to cook with our parents or grandparents, cooking with your friends, holidays and funerals, food habits and preferred flavored combinations. All of this comes to us from experiences that we've either lived out at some point in our life. And then, of course, media campaigns and advertising. Appreciating flavor is something that we can learn over time. And what I always encourage people to do is always keep an open mind. Even if you don't like something the first time, give it a second time, try it at a different place or in a new recipe, and perhaps you might like it. So there's always room for us to grow. And then finally, I wanted to talk about what a recipe is. A recipe is just so much more. And this is one of the recipes in my cookbook. And what I wanted to do was just break it down by the different steps that are taking place and what's going in. So if you look at it quickly, you can see the oil in the first part is providing richness. We've got salt in there, which provides the saltiness. We've got all these chemical reactions on the right-hand side, which are taking place, which produce flavors like caramelization and the Maillard reaction. And then we've got food textures, bitterness, and sweetness. And if you look at the different steps here, throughout this, a recipe is built on building these components in. So you've got mouthfeel, color, sight, sound, and all of these play a role in recipes. And at the end of the day, that is what I want people to appreciate while they cook at home, and also do this with your family and friends. Break it down and kind of take a moment to appreciate of what's happening, because it's so much more than just like that taste and aroma that you get at the end, but an experience. So that's all I have for you guys today. Hope you guys had fun.
Okay, thank you, Nick. We just went over a little bit on our time, but I think we have a few minutes to answer some of these questions really quick. For somebody that's looking to become a more adventurous eater, what food would you recommend they try?
What food you should, I mean, I won't say go for the most stinkiest food, but definitely go for something that you're excited about, because that will push you forward. That'll definitely, versus something you're not that excited about or you're feeling a little nervous about. I would say take small steps and then incrementally move forward. So in my case, I wanted to learn a lot about fermented foods. I started out with pickled sweet drinks, like the fermented pineapple drink that's made in South America. It's called tepache. That's where I actually started out. It was a fun way for me to get comfortable and move ahead.
Another person is asking, do you think our taste buds change over time? For example, we may or may not like something when we're younger, but maybe like it when we're older.
Yeah, absolutely true. And I think this is also true for aroma. We're born with a certain number of taste receptors. They keep increasing up to a certain point. And I think at some point during late teenhood, when you're a late teenager, it starts to dramatically drop. And that's why a lot of kids are highly sensitive to different tastes and terrible at eating. I was a terrible kid when it came to eating and cooking. And look at me now, that's my job. So there is hope. And we do lose our taste receptors over time. women are born with more taste receptors and more aroma receptors than men. So women are actually much better at this, at appreciating flavor.
I think we have time for one more. Are there any current food trends that you're excited about?
Any current food trends that I'm excited about? God, I keep thinking about ice cream and I don't know why, but perhaps because I just eat ice cream twice a week. In terms of trends, I will say cooking techniques, yes. I'm particularly excited about sous vide. It's something that I've been exploring at home. And I'm actually sous videing a pork tenderloin as we speak.
Okay. Thank you, Nick. I don't think we have time for any more questions. I am putting the survey link in the chat for anyone who's still in to take. Thank you very much. I have a couple more slides just to show everyone before we end out here. So let me just switch over to my screen. Thank you, Nick.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, some of the other programs that are being offered by NLM is it's All of Us is a research program sponsored by the National Institute of Health. Their goal is to have 1 million people come together and create the largest medical research database of its kind to speed up medical breakthroughs with precision medicine. If you're interested, please follow the links on our program landing page. And then there's also Medline Plus. Today, it's more important than ever to have access to quality and trusted medical information. Medline Plus is an online medical database with information that you can trust. There's also a section on recipes, and there's also a section on mental health. And you can reach Medline Plus by going to the link on our landing page or just going to medlineplus.gov. Thank you, everybody. And thanks again, Nick, for coming for our first of 3 of our cookbook author series. Please stop back on March 2nd at 7 p.m. for Bryant Terry and his book, Vegetable Kingdom. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks for having me. Bye.
Have a good night, everyone.